Something went wrong in those woods the night of the storm, and nobody who was there that night can agree on exactly what they saw. But they all agree that whatever it was watching them long before they knew it was there. My name is Mubarok, and tonight I'm going to take you deep into 5 nights where multiple people witnessed the same horror from different angles. And only by hearing every voice do you finally understand what truly happened. Keep your lights on, keep your headphones in, and whatever you do, do not go outside tonight. It was a Friday in late October, and the rain had been falling since noon over the Ochsner National Forest in northern Montana. 3 people drove into those woods that evening from 3 completely different directions. None of them knew the others existed. None of them had any reason to be afraid yet. But by midnight, all 3 of them would be running, and one of them would never explain what chased them. Not to the police, not to their families, not to anyone. The first was a man named Garrett Pell, 38 years old, a wildlife photographer from Billings who had made this drive 11 times before. He knew these roads the way you know your own kitchen at night, not by sight, but by memory. He'd taken thousands of photographs in Ochsner over the past 6 years, everything from elk herds to rare birds of prey, and he was comfortable in those woods in a way that most people never get to be. That comfort, as it turned out, was exactly the wrong thing to feel that night. The second was a woman named Dana Rourke, 26 years old, who was driving through on her way to visit her brother in Kalispell. Her GPS had rerouted her through the Forest Reserve Road after a section of Route 2 was closed for emergency repairs. She had a full tank of gas, a phone charger that was actually working for once, and a playlist she'd been building for 3 months. She was relaxed. She was singing. She had absolutely no intention of stopping in those woods, but her car had a different plan. The third was a 16-year-old boy named Cole Varney, who had ridden his dirt bike out into the forest with 2 of his friends that afternoon to explore an abandoned ranger station they'd heard about from older kids at school. His friends had turned back around 4 o'clock when the rain started getting serious. Cole had kept going. He told himself he just wanted to get a look at the building before dark. He was 17 minutes away from regretting that decision for the rest of his life. Garrett had parked his truck at the trailhead off Forest Road 9 just after 7 in the evening. The rain was light then, barely a drizzle, and the air had that clean electric smell that comes right before a real storm decides to commit. He pulled his camera bag from the back seat, layered up, and headed down the eastern trail toward the creek bed, where he'd photographed a family of beavers back in August. He wasn't expecting drama. He was expecting to sit quietly, listen to the rain, and maybe catch some long exposure shots of the water moving through the fog. What he found instead, about 40 minutes into his hike, was a trail camera he had never set up. He stopped when he saw it. It was zip-tied to a pine tree at about chest height, angled down the trail toward where he'd just come from. Not the kind of camera the Park Service used. Those were green and marked with agency stickers. This one was jet black, no markings, no serial number plate visible. The mounting bracket was newer than the camera itself, which told Garrett that someone had recently moved it here or re-angled it. The lens was pointed south. He was standing north of it, which meant the camera was aimed at whatever was walking up behind him. He turned around slowly. The trail was empty, just rain and trees, and the sound of water moving somewhere in the dark. He stood there for a full minute, watching the trail behind him, before he convinced himself it was probably just a hunter's trail cam, or maybe even a wildlife research setup. He took a photograph of it, just in case, and kept walking. That photograph would later become important. About 12 miles away, Dana Rourke's car made a sound she'd never heard before. It wasn't a bang or a pop. It was more like a deep, tired groan from somewhere under the floorboards, followed immediately by the steering wheel pulling hard to the right. She corrected, held it, but then her dashboard lit up like a Christmas tree, and the car began slowing down on its own as the power steering completely gave out. She managed to coast to the narrow gravel shoulder and stopped the car about 30 yards past a rusted green sign that read OH now RTH, RAD ENDS 4 MI. She sat in the car for a moment with the hazard lights blinking and the rain drumming on the roof, doing that thing people do when something goes wrong, hoping that if she sat still long enough, the problem would undo itself. It didn't. She checked her phone. 1 bar, barely. She tried to open Google Maps and watched the loading circle spin for 45 seconds before giving up. She tried calling her brother. The call connected. She heard his voice say hello, and then the line dropped. She turned on her flashlight app and stepped out into the rain to look at the tires. The front right tire was completely flat. Not deflating, already flat. Sitting on the rim, the rubber bunched and twisted in a way that told her it had been compromised for a while before finally giving out. She looked at it and then looked down the road in both directions. There were no lights, no sounds except the rain and the forest. Her spare was in the trunk, but she had never in her life changed a tire by herself in the dark, and she didn't have roadside assistance coverage. She dropped it from her plan 3 months ago to save money. She got back in the car, locked the doors, and tried her brother again. This time the call didn't connect at all. It was at that exact moment that she noticed something in her rearview mirror. In the woods on the left side of the road, just past the tree line, there was a light. Not a flashlight beam, more like a faint amber glow, diffused by rain and leaves, like something burning low and steady deep between the trees. She watched it for a while, trying to decide if it was a house or a lantern or her imagination. It didn't flicker the way fire flickers. It didn't sweep the way a flashlight sweeps. It just sat there, steady and pale gold, about 100 feet into the trees, watching the road. She told herself it was a farmhouse. She was wrong. Cole Varney had found the ranger station. It was smaller than he'd expected. A single-room structure built from timber and corrugated metal. The roof half collapsed on one side. The wooden steps rotted through, so that you had to step over them to get to the door. The door itself was unlocked, or more accurately, the door had no lock left, just a hole where the hardware used to be. He'd gone in with his helmet light on and swept the space. There was old furniture, a metal desk, no chair, a bulletin board on the wall with papers still pinned to it, warped and yellowed from moisture, but the printed text still legible in places. A topographic map of the forest that someone had marked up with a red pen. Circles, mostly, and some lines connecting them, and in the lower margin a note in handwriting too small for Cole to read without getting very close. He got very close. The handwriting said, "Movement patterns do not correspond to any known ungulate or predator. Bipedal. Consistent 4.2 mph ground speed across varied terrain. Not reacting to human scent. Responding to sound." Cole read it twice. Then he read it a third time. Then he stepped back from the bulletin board and looked at the door, which he'd left open when he came in. The rain was coming down hard now, drumming on the metal roof so loud it was almost difficult to think. He told himself the note was old. He told himself someone had been studying something completely explainable and just described it in a way that sounded alarming. He told himself a lot of things in those 30 seconds. Then something outside responded to the sound of the rain hitting the metal roof by moving through the undergrowth directly behind the station wall. Slow and heavy and deliberate. 4.2 miles per hour, and Cole stopped telling himself anything at all. Back on the eastern trail, Garrett Pell had reached the creek bed and set up his tripod. The rain was coming harder now, and he'd pulled up his hood and hunkered down at the bank, watching the water through his viewfinder. The fog was thicker than he'd expected, rolling in low over the water in long lazy waves, and it made the creek look like something from a painting. Beautiful in a way that was almost too perfect to be real. The kind of scene that makes you forget for a moment that you're alone in the woods at night, in the middle of a rainstorm. He had been sitting there for about 20 minutes when he noticed the beaver dam was wrong. He knew this dam. He'd photographed it in 4 different seasons. He knew the shape of it, the height, the particular angle of the sticks on the south end, and something about it tonight looked different. Not destroyed, not disturbed, just subtly, wrongly different. The way a room looks when someone has moved something inside it while you were gone. He zoomed in with his lens. tried to figure out what was off. Then he understood. There were handprints in the mud on the far bank. Not animal prints, human handprints, large and widely spaced, pressed into the soft clay above the waterline, as if someone had crouched there and steadied themselves, leaning forward over the water, looking at something on the other side. Looking, perhaps, at where Garrett was sitting right now. The prints were fresh. The rain hadn't blurred them yet. Garrett slowly lowered his camera from his face. He looked across the creek without the viewfinder. The fog was dense enough that the far bank was mostly obscured, but not completely. In the space between two pine trees on the opposite shore, there was a shape that was darker than the fog around it, standing perfectly still, at a height that was roughly consistent with a very tall person who had not yet decided whether to move. Garrett did not look directly at it. He had read enough about animal behavior over the years to know that direct eye contact is an escalation. He kept his gaze slightly left of center and began very slowly folding his tripod. The shape did not move. He picked up his bag. The shape did not move. He began walking north, back the way he came, at a pace that was not quite running, because running, in every wilderness guide he'd ever read, is the single worst thing you can do when something is watching you. The shape did not move until he was 30 feet up the trail. And then it did. Dana had made a decision. The light in the trees was still there, still steady, and she had decided it was a structure of some kind, which meant there was potentially a person, which meant there was potentially a working phone, or at minimum another human being. She pulled on her rain jacket, grabbed her phone with the flashlight app running, and got out of the car. She crossed the ditch at the road's edge and stepped into the tree line. The forest swallowed the sound of the rain almost immediately. Under the canopy, the sound changed from a sharp drumming to a low, constant hiss, like something breathing. Her flashlight swept the ground ahead of her. Pine needles, roots, a few scattered rocks, nothing alarming. The amber light ahead of her was still visible through the trees, a little clearer now, a little larger. She kept walking toward it. She had gone maybe 60 feet into the trees when her flashlight passed over a length of orange surveying tape tied to a branch at about shoulder height. She stopped and looked at it. Then she moved her flashlight and found another length tied to the next tree over, and another on the tree after that. Someone had marked a path here recently, the tape still vivid and unmuted by weather. She followed it because it seemed to be leading toward the light. The path bent left, then right, then opened into a small clearing in the trees, maybe 30 feet across, and in the center of the clearing there was a structure. Not a house, not a hunting blind. It was a kind of tower, or maybe scaffold was a better word. 4 wooden posts sunk into the ground in a rough square, about 10 feet apart, connected by horizontal bracing, with a platform at the top maybe 15 feet up. The amber light was coming from a lantern hung from the platform, a real oil lantern burning steadily. Below the platform, tied to one of the vertical posts, was a heavy waterproof bag, military surplus style, still sealed. The clearing was empty, but the mud around the base of the structure was pressed down with multiple sets of footprints, all of them leading in one direction, north, into the deeper forest, away from the road. Someone had been here recently, multiple someones. They had come here, and then they had left in a hurry, all in the same direction, and they had left their lantern burning and their bag behind. Dana reached out and touched the bag. It was solid and heavy. She unzipped the top flap. Inside was a radio, a first aid kit, a map in a waterproof sleeve, and a notebook. She pulled out the notebook and opened it. The first page said, in neat block letters, Munintari Logi, Citiusaviem, Dio Note Romvia from Citi. She flipped to the most recent entry, which was dated that same day, that same Friday evening, 3 hours ago. It said, confirmed visual on subject. Single entity, bipedal, approximately 7 to 7.5 feet in estimated standing height. Movement pattern consistent with previous observations. Subject appears to have altered search pattern, no longer moving parallel to creek, now moving toward road corridor. Extraction requested. Awaiting confirmation. Do not approach. Repeat, do not approach. Dana closed the notebook. She closed the bag. She took 3 steps toward the road, stopped, and looked back at the lantern. It was still burning. The people who left it burning had left in a hurry. They had left toward the deeper forest, away from the road, away from the direction of whatever they were monitoring. And the thing they were monitoring was now moving toward the road where her car was sitting with its hazards still blinking. She started running. Cole had gotten out of the ranger station through the window on the north side, dropping into the mud and immediately pressing himself flat against the outside wall, listening. The sound of movement around the back of the building had stopped when he moved. That was almost worse than if it had kept going, because it meant that whatever was back there had heard him shift his weight and had gone still, which is what a predator does when it's deciding whether it has been discovered. He waited. Rain, roof, rain, roof. He moved 2 inches to his left. From behind the building, a single heavy footstep in the mud, adjusting position, mirroring him. Cole's whole body went cold. He looked toward where he'd left his dirt bike, about 40 yards from the station's front door, leaned against a pine tree at the edge of the clearing. 40 yards of open ground in the rain, helmet off, no visibility, moving on foot. And then what? Start the engine, which makes an enormous amount of noise, and drive out in the dark on a rain-soaked trail. He ran the mouth in about 4 seconds and decided it was the only option he had. He pushed off the wall and ran. He heard the thing behind the station move at the same time he did, not running, not matching his speed exactly, just moving steadily and without hesitation around the corner of the building into the clearing. He didn't look back. He ran with everything he had, slipping once in the mud, catching himself, reaching the dirt bike, and swinging his leg over it in one motion he hadn't known he was capable of, and hitting the ignition and pulling the throttle before he was fully seated. The engine caught on the second try. He looked back over his shoulder as he lurched forward. At the far end of the clearing, at the edge of the tree line, there was a shape standing in the rain. It was tall, taller than a person should be, and it was watching him with what he could only describe later, talking to his parents at 1 in the morning with mud on his face and his hands still shaking, as a kind of patience, like it was not upset that he was leaving, like it had already decided that wasn't a problem, like it knew something about what was ahead of him on that trail that he didn't know yet. He drove anyway, fast, reckless, the headlight bouncing off trees and rain and roots, the trail barely wide enough in places, branches slapping his arms and face. He drove for about 6 minutes before his headlight swept across something in the trail ahead of him, and he locked the brakes. It was Dana Rourke. She was running down the middle of the forest access road, phone flashlight in her hand, completely soaked, and when his headlight hit her, she spun around and made a sound that was somewhere between a scream and a gasp. He stopped the bike, and she stopped running, and they stared at each other for about 3 seconds. Then she said, completely out of breath, "Is there someone following you?" And he said, "Yes." And she said, "Me too." They moved together after that, him walking the bike slowly so she could keep pace, her phone flashlight angled behind them on the trail. They had covered maybe a 1/4 mile toward the main road when they heard, from somewhere in the trees to their left, at a measured, consistent pace, footsteps, heavy, unhurried, paralleling their route. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them stopped moving. The footsteps kept pace with them for about 3 minutes, then simply stopped. No crash of undergrowth, no splash of departure, just gone, as if whatever was making them had stepped sideways out of the world. 2 minutes after that, they broke out of the tree line onto Forest Road 9 and saw, 30 yards ahead, a man walking toward them at a near jog with a camera bag over one shoulder and a tripod tucked under his arm and his hood soaked through, and his face doing that very specific thing that faces do when a person has been terrified recently and is trying to hold it together until they are somewhere safe. That was Garrett Pell. He stopped when he saw them. They all stood in the road for a moment in the rain looking at each other, dripping and wild-eyed, the way strangers look at each other when they realize they've all just come from the same direction. Garrett said, "Something was following me on the east trail. Dana said. Something was following me through the trees. I found a monitoring station. Research notes. Surveyors. They ran. Cole said. I found notes in the old ranger station. Something bipedal. They said it responds to sound. Garrett looked at both of them for a long moment. Then he reached into his camera bag and pulled out his camera and scrolled back through his photographs until he found the one he'd taken of the trail camera zip tied to the pine tree. He turned the screen to show them. In the corner of the photograph, in the background, barely visible through the trees, there was a shape, tall, still, standing off the trail at the edge of the frame. It was looking at the camera, not at the trail, at the camera itself, as if it understood what the camera was for, as if it had been watching the watchers for a very long time. The three of them walked out to the main road together and waited there in the rain for Garrett's cell signal to come back. He called the county sheriff's office at 9:14. Deputies arrived at 10:40. They went into the forest with flashlights and radios and found the monitoring station Dana had described, the ranger station Cole had found, and the trail camera Garrett had photographed. But the trail camera had been removed from the pine tree. The zip tie was still there. The camera was gone. They found the handprints by the creek bed. They were too large to be any person's hands. The investigators took casts. The report cited unconfirmed wildlife contact and was filed and closed within 30 days. Cole never rode his dirt bike into the woods again. Dana moved her brother's number to speed dial number 1 on her phone. Garrett still has the photograph, the one with the shape in the background. He's shown it to 3 separate wildlife biologists. None of them have been willing to tell him what they think it is. Not on the record, anyway. Off the record, the last one said something to him quietly before she left his office that he has never repeated to anyone. He has, however, stopped visiting Ochsner National Forest permanently. The second story starts in a different kind of darkness, not deep woods darkness, road darkness. The kind you get on a long stretch of interstate after midnight, when the towns have stopped appearing and the only light comes from your own headlights, making a pale tunnel through nothing. This one involves 4 people who are traveling together and experience the same impossible night from 4 completely separate moments of understanding. And the terrifying thing is that none of them understood what was happening until it was already over. Marcus Webb was driving. He was 29, a graduate student in mechanical engineering, and he was the kind of person who drove on road trips because he didn't trust anyone else's highway habits. He had a thermos of black coffee, an audiobook running at 1.35 speed, and a very specific system for taking 10-minute rest stops every 2 hours. His 3 passengers were his girlfriend Priya, her college roommate Jess, and Jess's boyfriend Owen, and they were all somewhere in the back portion of a 6-hour drive from Columbus to Nashville for a weekend trip. It was 2:17 in the morning. Everyone except Marcus was asleep. Marcus was not having a good drive. He was tired in the specific way that feels like your eyes are operating slightly behind your intentions. Everything you look at takes a half-second too long to register. He had opened his window despite the November cold, because the cold was the only thing keeping him fully functional. He had told himself 3 times already that he was fine. None of those times had he fully believed himself. The exit sign for Jellicoe, Tennessee appeared in his headlights, and he made a snap decision to take it. Not because Jellicoe was the plan, but because there was a well-lit gas station visible from the ramp, and well-lit gas stations at 2 in the morning are the kind of thing tired drivers on dark roads feel an almost religious gratitude for. He eased onto the ramp, let the truck decelerate, and glanced in the rearview mirror, all 3 passengers still asleep. Good, he'd be in and out in 10 minutes, enough time to stretch. Refill the coffee, splash water on his face. What Marcus noticed when he pulled into the gas station parking lot, the station was lit, but the inside lights were off. The open sign in the window was dark. There was one other vehicle in the lot, an older Ford pickup, dark blue, parked at the far end near the air pump, engine off. He pulled up to a pump out of habit, got out, and only then fully registered that there was no one inside the station. He checked his phone. 2:21. The posted hours on the glass door said open 24 hours. The door was locked. He stood there for a moment, not particularly alarmed, just recalibrating. There was another gas station about a mile back on the highway. He'd just go there. He turned toward his car, and that was when he noticed the man standing beside the blue pickup truck. The man was old, maybe 70, maybe older, wearing a canvas jacket and no hat in the cold, standing very straight beside his truck with his hands at his sides. He wasn't pumping gas. He wasn't on his phone. He was just standing there watching Marcus, in the flat white light of the station canopy, his face still and his eyes direct and his posture completely still in the way that old men sometimes are still. Not with rigidity, but with a kind of accumulated patience. Marcus nodded at him. The old man did not nod back. He did not look away. He just watched. Marcus got in his car and pulled out of the lot. Priya woke up at 2:47 because Marcus hit the brakes. Not a panic stop, just a firm, sudden deceleration that jolted everyone forward slightly. She surfaced from a deep and formless sleep into the dark interior of the car, immediately confused about where she was, reaching out instinctively for something to hold. She found the armrest and stabilized herself and looked at the road ahead. They were on a 2-lane road, not the highway. The time read 2:47, and she had no memory of an exit. "Where are we?" she said. Marcus answered too fast. "Just cutting through town. Had to detour." She accepted that for about 40 seconds, looking out the window at dark storefronts and empty sidewalks, and the kind of small town geography that looks identical at night everywhere in America. Then she noticed something odd. The car had slowed to well below the speed limit. Marcus was driving maybe 15 miles per hour, leaning slightly forward over the wheel, scanning the road in a way that suggested he was looking for something specific. "Marcus, what are you looking for?" He hesitated. "Nothing, just watching the speed limit." She looked at the speedometer. 15 miles per hour in a 25 zone. She looked at him. He was doing the thing he did when he was keeping information from her, driving with both hands when he usually drove with one, jaw tight, eyes moving more than they needed to. She had dated him for 3 years. She knew his physical vocabulary the way you know a language you grew up speaking. "Pull over," she said quietly. "Priya, we're fine." "Marcus, pull over." He pulled over, and then he told her what he hadn't told her yet, that the detour from Jellicoe had not been a planned detour, that he had seen something on the side of the road about a mile after the gas station. A person, standing at the road's edge, facing the road, thumb up, the universal gesture of someone wanting a ride, that he had driven past them because they were on a dark road at 2 in the morning, and nobody stops for hitchhikers on dark roads at 2 in the morning. That he had checked his rearview mirror 100 yards later to see if they were still there. They were not there. There was no one on the road behind him. The person had simply not been there anymore, which was physically impossible, given that Marcus was already at highway speed and the road behind him was straight and open for a quarter mile. He had taken the next turn because he needed to not be on that specific stretch of road anymore. He had not told Priya because he didn't know how to explain what he'd seen without sounding like he was losing it. In the back seat, neither Jess nor Owen was asleep anymore. Owen had heard everything. Owen Castellano was 27 years old, and he had been awake since before Marcus had taken the Jellicoe exit, staring at the ceiling of the car with his eyes half open the way you do when you've been trying to sleep for hours and sleep has stopped cooperating. He had seen Marcus take the exit. He had felt the car slow at the gas station. He had watched through barely open eyes as Marcus had come back to the car more quickly than a bathroom break would explain, and he had noticed the look on Marcus's face in the rearview mirror. Not the regular focused calm of someone managing a long drive, but something tighter and less managed. He had also seen the figure on the road. Not clearly. His position in the back seat gave him a partial angle, and he'd only had a moment before Marcus passed it. But he had seen enough to notice that whoever it was, they were not dressed for November. No jacket, no coat, standing in a tank top and shorts in 40-degree weather at 2 in the morning, arm thumb out, thumb up, perfectly still. For a fraction of a second Owen had thought, that person is going to freeze to death out here. And then Marcus had accelerated, and they were past it. What Owen had not told Marcus, what he'd been lying in the back seat, trying to convince himself of an innocent explanation for, was what he'd seen when he'd craned his neck to look through the rear window after they'd passed. The figure had not been at the road's edge anymore, which he could have accepted. People move. Hitchhikers give up and walk. That's fine. What was not fine was where the figure now appeared to be. Because when Owen turned to look through the rear windshield a few seconds after they passed, it was visible in the distance in the center of the road, standing in the middle of the lane they'd just driven through, watching the car's retreating headlights. Standing in the road, not at the edge, in the road, which meant it had crossed the road behind them faster than a person can cross a road. A quarter second after they passed, in the dark, he had closed his eyes and told himself he hadn't seen it correctly. Now, sitting in the parked car on a side street in Jellicoe at 2:47 while Marcus and Priya talked quietly in the front seats, he cleared his throat and said, "I saw it too." Jess was the last one to speak. She was 26, Priya's roommate from their freshman year at Ohio State, the kind of person who was consistently the most practical and least dramatic person in any group she was part of. She was also, quietly, the person in the car who had been most unsettled since they'd taken the Jellicoe exit, and not because of the figure on the road. Jess had been asleep, genuinely asleep, not Owen's half-waking doze, when they'd passed it. She hadn't seen anything on the road. What Jess had seen was something different. What Jess had seen was in her dream. She knew this was going to sound insane, and she said so, preemptively, before she told them. She said she knew it was just a dream. She knew how it was going to sound. She knew that dreams are just your brain processing noise and sensation while you sleep. She said all of that first. Then she described it. In the dream, she had been standing on a dark road at night, alone, cold in a way that felt real and specific rather than dreamed. A car had driven past her without stopping. She'd watched its taillights disappear. She had known in the dream with total certainty, the way you know things in dreams, that this happened all the time, that this was simply what being where she was like, that she had been standing at the edge of various roads for a very long time. She'd woken up when Marcus hit the brakes. She told them this in the parked car on the side street. When she was done, there was a silence in the car that had a texture to it, a density, like silence after a loud sound. Nobody said anything for a while. The engine was running. The heater was running. The audiobook had continued playing on Marcus's phone at 1.35 speed, tinny and muffled in his jacket pocket, and he reached down and stopped it. They drove back to the interstate via a different route than the one they'd come in on. Nobody suggested doubling back on the two-lane road. The hitchhiker, whatever it was, wherever it went, was not discussed again for the rest of the drive to Nashville. When they arrived, they checked into the hotel and went to their separate rooms, and it wasn't until the next morning over breakfast that anyone brought it up again. And what got brought up wasn't the question of what they'd seen, but the question of what it had wanted. That question none of them ever successfully answered. Marcus switched his audiobook to something lighter for the drive home Sunday. He has never taken the Jellicoe exit again, even in daylight. Owen has not told the story to anyone who wasn't in the car. Priya asked Jess once, months later, whether she'd had a dream like that again. Jess said no. She said it in the way people say things that are not quite true. Not lying, exactly. Just choosing to stop the conversation in a particular place, because going further doesn't lead anywhere she wants to be. The third story is set in a place most people wouldn't think of as particularly frightening. A summer camp. Off-season. December, so the grounds are empty except for the permanent maintenance staff, which, at Camp Edgerton in the Allegheny Mountains of Pennsylvania, consists of exactly 2 people. A maintenance supervisor named Ron Pratchett, 51 years old, who'd worked at the camp for 16 years, and his assistant, a 22-year-old named Willa Bauer, who'd taken the off. season caretaker position because it came with free housing, and she was saving money to travel. They were supposed to be alone. They were not. Ron discovered this first, and in a way that would have been easy to dismiss if he hadn't spent 16 winters at this camp and known every sound it made. It was the 3rd week of December. The camp had shut down for the season at the end of August, and the grounds were in full winter mode. Boats pulled and stacked in the equipment barn, cabins locked and shuttered, the main lodge heated only enough to prevent pipe damage, the kitchen stripped down to its bones. Ron's daily routine was well established. Check the perimeter fence line in the morning, inspect the cabin roofs for ice or damage after any heavy snow, check the lodge heating system, make whatever repairs had come up. Willa handled the administrative and communication side, checking messages from the camp director, logging daily reports, doing the light maintenance tasks. They ate dinner together most evenings in the small staff house, near the main gate, and watched television, and went to their rooms at a reasonable hour. It was quiet in the way that places are quiet when they have been designed for noise, and the noise is temporarily gone. The noise that woke Ron at 3:15 on a Tuesday morning was not a camp noise. It was a sustained, low creak from the main lodge, the specific sound of someone walking slowly across the wooden floor of the great hall. He lay in bed for 20 seconds listening to it. 1, 2, 3. The pattern of footsteps, slightly uneven, moving from the north end of the lodge toward the fire pit at the center. He knew that sound. He'd heard his own feet make it 4,000 times. Someone was walking across the great hall. He got dressed, took the heavy flashlight from his bedside table, and walked across the dark camp to the main lodge. The lodge was locked. He unlocked it. He went inside and swept the great hall with his flashlight. Empty. Every chair stacked as he'd left them. Every table pushed to the walls. No footprints in the dust. No sign of entry at the windows. He checked the storage room, the office, the kitchen access. Everything locked from the inside. He stood in the middle of the great hall for a while, listening. The lodge settled around him. Wind against the shuttered windows. No footsteps. No person. He went back to bed and made a note of it in his log the next morning. His log entry said, possible animal in lodge. Will check exterior for entry points. He didn't find any. He didn't tell Willa. Willa found out on her own 3 days later, though not because of the lodge. She had been doing her afternoon perimeter walk, something she'd added to her routine because the camp was remote enough that she felt better knowing where everything was. When she discovered that the equipment barn was unlocked, the main padlock on the sliding door was gone entirely. Not broken, not cut. The clasp it had been securing was bent open, as if the lock had been worked loose from the outside over time. She pushed the barn door open and looked inside. The boats were exactly where Ron had stacked them in August. The kayaks, the canoes, the small sailboat components, all of it properly racked and covered with canvas tarps. But on the dirt floor of the barn, in the space between the rack and the wall, there were signs of recent habitation. A flattened area where something or someone had been lying, an old camp blanket. Willa recognized the Edgerton logo on it, so it had come from somewhere on campgrounds. Spread on the ground, folded once. A collection of small objects arranged in a careful line along the base of the wall, a pine cone, and 3 smooth creek stones, a strip of orange surveying tape, a rusted tent stake, a chewing gum wrapper flattened and folded into a small rectangle. She picked up the chewing gum wrapper and turned it over. On the inside, in pencil, in small but legible handwriting, were the words "still here." She set the wrapper down. She took photographs of everything with her phone. She went and found Ron. Ron looked at the photographs. He looked at them for a long time. Then he told her about the footsteps in the lodge. He told her he hadn't mentioned it because he hadn't been sure, hadn't wanted to alarm her, had told himself it was probably an animal. He told her he'd been wrong to do that. His face, when he said this, had the look of a man doing a silent accounting of the past 3 days, measuring what might have been watching him while he checked fence lines and inspected roofs, and arriving at a number he didn't like. They called the camp director. The director called the county sheriff. 2 deputies drove up that afternoon and walked the perimeter and inspected the barn and took their own photos. They found no one on camp property. They found footprints on the outer perimeter fence line, consistent with someone who had been walking it. The same path, the same direction, repeatedly, over a period of several days. The prints went to the fence line and stopped. No prints on the other side of the fence, leading away. Nobody could explain that. The investigators put it in the category of things that are easy to dismiss in a report. There was a third perspective to that camp story, though. One that Ron and Willa never knew about. About 4 miles from Camp Edgerton, there was a small rental cabin that a couple named Steve and Margot Hendricks had booked for the first 2 weeks of December on a hiking and birding trip. Steve was a retired schoolteacher. Margot was a semi-professional birder who kept meticulous logs, and they'd been coming to this part of the Alleghenies for 6 straight winters. They knew the area well enough to have opinions about which trails were best in which conditions, and they were, by any measure, sensible and grounded people with no particular history of dramatic experiences. On December 18th, Margot noted in her birding log, not a story, not a dramatic account, just her plain factual field log that she'd been keeping in the same format for 11 years, that she had observed at approximately 6:45 in the morning from the cabin porch, a figure moving through the tree line at the northern edge of the field below the cabin. She noted that it appeared to be a tall person, moving at the edge of the trees parallel to the field. She noted that she had initially assumed it was a hiker on the trail, but the direction of movement did not correspond to any trail she knew of, and the speed was inconsistent with hiking. Too slow for purposeful movement, too steady for rest or observation. She noted that she had watched it for approximately 4 minutes before it moved back into the tree line and out of sight. She noted that it did not appear to be carrying anything. She noted that she could not determine what it was. And then, because she was a careful and methodical person, she turned to the next day's log entry and wrote at the top, "Revisit northern tree line observation. Confirm trail routing. Ask Steve if he saw same." Her handwriting was neat. Her notation was precise. Her concern, rendered in field log format, was completely legible. In the margin she had written one additional word, circled twice. That word was patient. Whoever, whatever, had been at Camp Edgerton during those December weeks left no further evidence of their presence after the sheriff's visit. The arranged objects in the barn were bagged as evidence and never returned. Ron Pratchett finished out the winter season and submitted his resignation in February, citing the desire to work somewhere less isolated. Willa Barr left in January. The camp director hired 2 new caretakers for the following winter. Their first week on the job, one of them found the camp blanket, the one with the Edgerton logo, folded neatly on the steps of cabin 7, which had been locked since August. They assumed someone on the previous staff had left it there. They picked it up and put it in the supply closet. They didn't look inside it. The 4th story comes from a woman named Teresa Mullen, a man named Darian Park, and a truck driver named Chuck Weston. And it takes place on a stretch of rural highway in northern Wisconsin on a March night when the snow had been falling for 8 hours and the plows hadn't come through yet, and the road had that particular deceptive quality winter roads have when they look passable and are not. Teresa was driving because Darian had offered to drive and she'd said no, because Darian's night vision wasn't as good as hers, and she knew it and he knew it, and they'd been together long enough that this didn't require explanation. She was a focused, capable driver, and she handled winter roads well. She had driven this particular stretch of highway 100 times, including in worse conditions than tonight. She was not afraid of this road. What she was afraid of, by 9:30 that evening, was the car behind her. It had appeared in her rearview mirror about 20 minutes after she'd gotten on the highway, and at first she'd paid it no particular attention. Just another set of headlights, following at a reasonable distance, another person making their way carefully through the accumulating snow. But over the next 20 minutes, she'd become increasingly aware of its behavior. It didn't speed up, It didn't slow down. When she slowed for a curve, it slowed. When she accelerated on a straight, it accelerated. It maintained exactly the same distance from her rear bumper, close enough that she could see it was a sedan, dark-colored, no distinctive features. For the entire time she'd been watching it, she changed lanes. The car changed lanes. She took an exit and drove a half-mile on the county road and turned around and got back on the highway. The car was not on the county road. She got back on the highway going south, and within 4 minutes the same headlights were in her rearview mirror again at the same distance, same pace, same locked on steadiness. She reached over and put her hand on Darian's arm and squeezed. He woke up immediately. "Car behind us," she said. "Been following us for a while." Darian turned to look. "How long?" 25, 30 minutes. Could be coincidence. Took an exit. Got back on. It found us again. He didn't say anything after that for a moment. Then he said, "Don't slow down." She didn't slow down. Darian Park had been awake, actually, for about 10 minutes before Teresa squeezed his arm. He'd surfaced from sleep gradually, groggy and disoriented, and had been doing that thing where you hover at the edge of awareness without fully committing to consciousness. He'd registered the dark highway and the falling snow and the movement of the wipers and Teresa's focused profile, and had begun the slow drift back towards sleep. He had not been asleep when she slowed for the exit. He'd felt the car slow and curve and stop, and he'd opened his eyes. He'd seen her face, tight with something that wasn't quite concentration and wasn't quite fear, but was the combination of both that he associated with her managing a situation she didn't fully have control of. He'd closed his eyes again and waited. The fact that he was already awake when she touched his arm meant that when she said a car had been following them for 30 minutes, he didn't have the lag of the newly awakened. His mind was already running. And what his mind immediately reached for was something that had happened 2 weeks ago that he hadn't told Teresa because he hadn't known what to make of it. 2 weeks ago he'd been driving home from work alone at night on the same highway, heading north while she was heading south now. A car had followed him. Same behavior, locked distance, matching speed, unfazed by lane changes. He'd taken the same exit strategy she'd just used. The car had vanished and reappeared. He'd driven the rest of the way home, 10 miles per hour over the limit, and not mentioned it because it had stopped, and he'd convinced himself he'd been paranoid. Now he was recalculating. He didn't tell her any of this yet. He said, "Take the next exit. Stay on it. Don't go back to the highway for at least a mile." She took the next exit. The car behind them did not follow onto the ramp. Chuck Weston was southbound on the same highway, about 6 miles behind Teresa and Darian's car. He drove a refrigerated freight truck for a produce distributor based out of Green Bay, and he had been driving this stretch of highway 3 nights a week for going on 4 years. He knew its moods. He knew where the black ice formed first, where the plows skipped, where the deer crossings clustered. He drove it the way long-haul drivers drive roads they know, with the particular relaxed alertness of deep familiarity. He noticed the sedan about 8 miles north of where Teresa and Darian first picked it up in their mirror. He noticed it because it was doing something that good drivers don't do on snowy roads at night. Driving without headlights. No running lights, no headlights, nothing. Moving at highway speed through falling snow on an unlit road with 0 visibility lights, which is not just unusual. It is something that should be physically impossible, because you cannot drive a modern highway at highway speed in a snowstorm at night without lights and see where you are going. Chuck had slowed, thinking at first that maybe the driver had forgotten to turn their lights on and would realize it any second. But the car had continued at exactly the same pace, no lights, moving in a straight line, maintaining its lane without drifting. He'd watched it for 4 miles. No lights. Perfect lane discipline. Consistent speed through the curves. He'd radioed dispatch to report a vehicle with no lights on the southbound lanes. Dispatch had told him they'd pass it to the state patrol. He'd watched in his mirrors as the car moved away from him into the dark. When Teresa had first spotted the car in her rearview mirror 20 minutes later, she had seen headlights. 2 of them. clear and bright. She had described them that way when she later told the story. She had been absolutely certain there were headlights. Chuck was absolutely certain there were none. The state patrol pulled over a dark, colored sedan on Highway 51 southbound at 10:14 that evening, 8 miles south of where Teresa and Darian had taken their exit. The vehicle was registered to an address in Madison. The driver was cooperative, licensed, and showed no signs of impairment. His headlights were on, functional, both of them. The patrol officer made a note that the vehicle matched a description called in by a commercial driver and confirmed all lights were operational and released the driver. The officer did not note in his report whether the driver's eyes responded normally to his flashlight. He did not note whether the driver's hands were warm or cold. He did not note whether the driver had any explanation for where he was going, or whether the driver's response to any of his questions had a slightly too long pause before it came, the way answers do when the question has to travel further than it should before it reaches wherever decisions are made. These things do not go in highway patrol reports. There is no checkbox for them. There is no form. Teresa has never driven that highway at night again. Darian told her about the time 2 weeks earlier, that same night, parked in the lot of a 24-hour diner 2 exits off the highway, over bad coffee, at almost 11 o'clock. She did not speak for a long time after he finished. Then she said, "You should have told me." He agreed. Chuck Weston still drives that highway 3 nights a week. He has never reported another vehicle without headlights. He has, however, developed a habit he can't fully account for. When he's southbound on that particular 8-mile stretch, he doesn't use his radio. He turns it off. He drives in silence. He is not sure why. When he tries to examine the feeling, it comes out to something like, "I don't want anything to know I'm here." That's a strange thought for a man on a well-lit highway in a 40-ton truck. He knows that. He's thought about it. He's arrived, after considerable deliberation, at the conclusion that the strangeness of the thought doesn't make it wrong. The 5th story is the one that doesn't leave you. This is the one that the other 4, in some way, were building toward. Not because they're connected by location or character, but because they're connected by a feeling, a shape of experience that all these people share. That feeling of being watched from multiple directions by something that already knows more about you than you know about it. This final story has 4 voices, and the worst thing about it is that all 4 of them were right. The Caldwell farmhouse had been empty for 11 years before Renata Voss bought it. She was 44, recently divorced, an architectural historian who'd spent 20 years writing about other people's spaces and had decided that she wanted, finally, a space of her own to work on. The farmhouse was a project. That was what she called it and how she thought about it. A project, something to absorb her attention. Something with clear problems that could be addressed with clear solutions. The kind of engagement that leaves no room in the mind for the other things you'd rather not be thinking about. The house was a 1920s 2-story frame construction on 40 acres in the Cumberland foothills of Tennessee. It had good bones. She'd said this to herself so many times in the first months that it had become a kind of private joke. And significant issues. The roof had been patched but not properly replaced. The original wiring was a liability. One of the downstairs rooms, the one that had been added on in 1954, according to the property records, had a persistent moisture problem. These were all fixable things. The property came with a caretaker, not a person, a structure, a small separate building about 200 yards behind the main house, down a gravel path, that had historically been used for equipment storage and had more recently, according to the selling agent, served as housing for a property manager who'd watched the house during its vacant years. The agent had mentioned this casually, the kind of casual that real estate agents use when they want a detail to land without weight. There had been a property manager. The property manager was no longer on the arrangement. The structure was empty. Renata had looked at it during her initial walk through and found it locked with a padlock that the selling agent didn't have the key to. She'd noted this and moved on. After closing, she'd had the lock cut and gone in. It was a single room, about 12 by 12, with a cot frame, a wooden table, 2 chairs. The windows were covered on the inside with heavy brown paper taped in place. In the corner, a small wood stove, clean, or at least emptied. No food, no personal effects, no clothing. The table had a ring stain from a mug and a stack of composition notebooks that were, she discovered when she opened them, completely blank. Every page of every notebook blank, like someone had brought them intending to write something and never begun. She'd left the structure alone. It was not part of the project. It was storage. She started the renovation in April. By June, she had a rotating crew of local contractors working through the interior. Electricians, plumbers, a plasterer for the damaged walls. She liked them. They were efficient and professional, and they did not, as contractors sometimes do in rural areas, make her feel like an outsider. They had opinions about the house. They shared them. She listened. It was a good working relationship. The first contractor to say something was Tommy Birch, who ran the electrical crew. He said it matter-of-factly, in the same tone he used for everything, standing in the kitchen doorway with a cup of his own coffee, because he'd learned Renata made it too weak. He said, "You aware someone's been in that back building?" She said, "I looked at it when I moved in. It was empty." He said, "I don't mean like in its history. I mean recent, like in the last few weeks. Wood stove's been used. I can smell it when I walk past." She'd gone to look. He was right. The wood stove had been used. Not recently enough to be warm, but recently enough that the ash inside was fresh and the inner surface of the stovepipe retained that particular chimney smell that only comes when a fire has burned. The composition notebooks on the table were still blank. The paper on the windows was still in place. But there was a mug on the table now, not a new mug. The old ring stain on the table surface matched the new mug exactly, suggesting the mug had always been there and had been put away and was now back. A white ceramic mug with no markings, clean, rim, down on the table. Renata felt something shift inside her that she would describe later as a recalibration. Like the moment when you understand a sentence you've been reading wrong. The empty house was not empty. Something was using the back structure. She changed the padlock that afternoon and kept both keys. 2 weeks later, the lock was not broken. It was not picked. The door was latched exactly as she'd left it, but when she opened it, the room was clearly occupied. The cot had a blanket on it now, military surplus, and the wood stove had been used again, and on the table there were 2 mugs, not one, both rimmed down, like a host setting a table. She called the county sheriff that afternoon. The investigating deputy found no sign of forced entry, no sign of how anyone could have gotten into a locked room. He suggested, gently, that it was possible she'd forgotten she had a spare key somewhere and someone locally knew the property and had access she didn't know about. He said this the way people say things when they want to be helpful, but know their explanation doesn't actually hold. She had the back building sealed. Boarded windows, hasp lock, padlock, the door hinges reinforced. She did not go in it again. The second contractor to say something was Bev Castillo, the plasterer, and she said it at the end of her last day on the job, in July, as she was loading her van. She said it in a different way than Tommy had. Not matter of fact, more reluctant. The way you say something you've been holding for a while and have finally decided you're not going to hold anymore. She said, "I want to tell you something about this property that I heard, and I want you to decide what you do with it." Renata said, "Tell me." Bev said that her grandmother had grown up 2 farms over and knew the Caldwell family, the original family, the ones who'd built the house in the 20s. She said that back in the 40s, there had been a thing the local people talked about. Not dramatically, just as a known feature of the Caldwell place, the same way local people know which houses have bad wells or which fields flood in spring. The thing they talked about was that something lived on the back part of the property, not in the house. The family had been fine, generations of them, no trouble. But the back acreage, toward the ridge, something out there that came in closer when it rained, something that, in her grandmother's phrase, kept track. Renata had looked at her for a moment. Then she'd said, "Kept track of what?" Bev had said, of who was on the property. Who came and who left, how many, whether the number going out matched the number coming in. She'd gotten in her van. She'd driven away. Renata had stood in the driveway for a while, listening to the late July insects and the distant thunder from a building storm in the west. And then she'd gone inside and made dinner and told herself that old local folklore was not a reason to abandon a renovation project. The third voice in this story belongs to a man named Phil Garrett. No relation to the photographer from the first story, just a common name, who had been the property manager of the Caldwell place for 6 of the 11 vacant years. He was 58 now, living in Crossville, and he had given up the property management role, not because the contract ended, but because he'd simply stopped going back. He'd told the previous owner he had health reasons. That was partially true. He'd had health reasons, and he'd had the other thing. The other thing was that in the 3rd year of watching the property, he had started keeping a log of what he observed. Not formally, just notes in a notebook, the same composition notebooks that Renata had found in the back building. He'd kept track of things that seemed off. He'd filled 4 notebooks and then, not because the notebooks were full, and not because the things stopped happening, but because the act of writing them down had started feeling dangerous, like it was drawing attention somehow. He'd taken all 4 notebooks out of the building and burned them in the wood stove. He'd put blank ones back because he hadn't wanted it to look like he'd removed anything. He hadn't fully been able to explain that reasoning to himself. It had felt important. What he'd logged in those notebooks in the 3 years before he stopped evidence of occupation in the main house, in rooms he had sealed, appearing and disappearing without consistent pattern. Objects moved between buildings overnight, patterns in the mud around the property perimeter consistent with a single entity walking the boundary repeatedly. A sound, 3 separate occasions, in the pre-dawn hours, from the ridge. Not a sound he could categorize as any known animal, not a sound that repeated in the same sequence twice, but clearly intentional, clearly structured, the way communication is structured. The 3rd occasion, the sound had come from the tree line 20 yards from the back building instead of from the ridge. Close enough that he'd heard it from inside the building, while lying on the cot with a flashlight and no plan. He had left the next morning and never come back. He would not have told anyone this story except that he'd received a call from the county sheriff's office in August asking whether he'd ever experienced any unusual access issues with the property. He'd said he had. The deputy had asked if he'd be willing to give a statement. He'd given one. He'd told most of it. He hadn't told the part about the sounds from the ridge because he didn't know how to put it in words that would be received without skepticism, and he'd had enough of not being believed about things he knew to be true. The 4th voice is the most recent. It is Renata's neighbor, Clem Adair, who farms the 300 acres that share a boundary with the Caldwell property to the east. He's 71 years old and has farmed this land his whole life, and his father farmed it before him. He knows this land the way you know the features of a face you've loved for decades. He knows it well enough to know when something in it has changed. He told Renata about it in September, over the fence between their properties, in the plain way that farmers in his part of Tennessee talk about things. Not dramatic, not embellished, just a sequence of observed facts delivered in order. He said that for the past several years he had been aware of something moving on the Caldwell property, along the perimeter, along the ridge, occasionally in the open fields behind the house. He said that in his experience. And he said this with a kind of settled weight that comes from a lifetime of paying attention. It had always been there, or at least as far back as he could trace, that it was more active when the property was occupied, that it seemed to be aware of activity, lights, vehicles, sounds, smoke from chimneys, and that awareness seemed to be a kind of orientation for it, a way of centering itself on the property. He said that he had no reason to think it meant harm. He said that in 70 years he'd never seen it cause harm. He said it in a way that was meant to be reassuring, but landed differently than intended. because what it implied was also true, that for 70 years he had known it was there, and had simply accepted it as a feature of the landscape, the same way he accepted the creek that flooded in spring and the south field that never drained properly, that it was just a thing that was. He said one more thing. He said that in his observation it was most active in bad weather, that rain and storms seemed to bring it out of the deeper property toward the edges, toward the occupied structures, toward where the light was. He didn't know why. He'd never asked it. He laughed quietly when he said that, a real laugh, dry and brief. He'd just observed it. Over 70 years, he'd observed it, and he'd farmed his land, and he'd raised his family, and the thing on the Caldwell property had done whatever it did, and the two of them had existed in the same landscape without any particular conflict. He looked at Renata across the fence. He said, "I just want you to know what you've bought, so you can decide how you feel about it." Renata stayed. She finished the renovation. She moved in fully in November. She kept the back structure sealed. She has not opened it again. On rainy nights, she sometimes looks out the rear windows of the house toward the ridge and the back creek, and sometimes she sees nothing, and sometimes she sees a shape moving at the field edge that might be a deer or might not be, and she stands at the window and looks at it for as long as it's there. She does not feel afraid, not exactly. She feels watched. She has decided that those are different things, and that the difference matters, and that she can live in a house where something keeps track of who comes and who goes as long as she knows that's what's happening. On the worst nights, the rainy nights when the storm comes down from the ridge and the back creek goes invisible in the dark and the wet, and she can see nothing past the edge of the yard light, she keeps a lamp on in the kitchen window, not for herself, for whatever is out there so it can find its center. She has never told anyone why she does this, until now. These 5 nights, the forest in Montana, the highway in Tennessee, the winter camp in Pennsylvania, the Wisconsin road in the snow, and the old Caldwell farm, they all have something underneath them that connects them. Not location, not the same creature, necessarily. Not even the same kind of fear. What they share is this in each one. Multiple people experienced the same event from different angles and arrived at different pieces of a truth that none of them could see whole on their own. That's how it always works with the things that actually scare us. Nobody gets the full picture. Nobody has all the angles. You get your fragment and you try to make sense of it, and mostly you can't. Mostly you file it away somewhere in the part of your mind reserved for things that don't have a satisfying explanation, and you move on, and you try not to think about it too much on rainy nights when the dark outside the window is doing that thing where it presses up against the glass. But right now, in this moment, I want you to drop a comment below and tell me, out of these 5 stories, which one got to you the most? Was it the mosaic of voices from that rainy Montana forest? Was it the car on the highway that appeared with headlights and without? Was it those composition notebooks in the back building, set out like a host expecting a guest? Or was it something smaller? One detail, one moment, one perspective that you're still turning over in your mind? Tell me. I read every comment, and your answers shape what stories come next on Lunar Lore. And if you know someone who can't sleep on stormy nights, someone who loves that specific feeling of a well-told story that gets under the skin and stays there, share this video with them right now. Not tomorrow. Right now, while it's raining and dark, and the feeling is still alive in you. They'll thank you for it, probably, and then they'll stay up until 3 in the morning and blame you for it. And honestly, that's exactly the kind of friend move I think we should all be making. This has been Mubarok on Lunar Lore. Stay safe out there. And whatever you do tonight, don't look at what's moving at the edge of your yard light. You weren't supposed to see that.